Okay, so now we've talked about blame. Let's talk about forgiveness. So we're reading Changing One's Heart. It's by Cheshire Calhoun. She's a professor here at ASU, and she's kind of a big shot. She does a lot of moral psychology, philosophy of emotion. That's kind of like the area that this paper is in. So in this paper, she sketches out a problem for a lot of common accounts of forgiveness. And she offers what she calls the aspirational account of forgiveness as a sort of means of dealing with some of these problems and a new way of thinking about certain cases of forgiveness. And she gives us some examples later in the paper. So, first, like many philosophers, she defines forgiveness as the giving up of certain negative reactive attitudes like blame or resentment. So, forgiveness is saying, listen, I am kind of moving on. Maybe I blamed you. Maybe I resented you for the bad thing that you did, but maybe you've atoned for it. And so I'm going to stop sort of holding you to account, and we're going to kind of move on from this. But Calhoun says that there's a problem with forgiveness or with common accounts of forgiveness. And it goes something like this. She says, often when we talk about forgiveness, we frame it in terms of reasons. For example, we ask questions like, does this person deserve to be forgiven? And then we might try to come up with reasons that might excuse their behavior or might be evidence that they've atoned for their wrongdoing and are willing to change so they won't commit this act in the future. Similarly, we might also think of other reasons, maybe not specifically related to the person, but reasons that why we ought to forgive them, all things considered. So maybe there aren't great reasons to think that this person deserves to be forgiven. Maybe they haven't atoned for it at all. Maybe we think they did kind of mean it, or whatever the case may be. But maybe we also think that what they did just wasn't so bad. It wasn't like it was wrong, but it wasn't a huge deal to us. And it's making our blood pressure really high to be angry all the time, or it's damaging or harming an otherwise good friendship. And so we think, all things considered, it wasn't a huge deal, but it's causing me more pain than it's worth it just to be angry. And so we ought to just forgive them and move on. So these seem like really common questions that you might consider when wondering if you should forgive someone. You might really say, should I forgive them? Ought I to forgive them? Would it be reasonable for me to forgive them? Or you might say, do they deserve to be forgiven? But Calhoun says that the problem with the forgiveness that results from these kinds of considerations is that it really just appears to be sort of a requirement of reason, such that to not forgive the person would just be irrational. And so in these cases, we might not even be forgiving someone for a wrongdoing, because if we are taking this sort of desert approach, which is the approach that she emphasizes a little bit more, asking the question, do they deserve to be forgiven? If we find reasons that they deserve to be forgiven, then we aren't really forgiving them for a wrongdoing, she says, because we've sort of distanced them from that wrongdoing anyway. So what we're doing isn't really anything that exceptional. So she gives this account of what she calls minimalist forgiveness. She says, under this account, we forgive someone because we think we have good reasons to forgive them. We either think we ought to, or we find that after reviewing all of the relevant facts related to the event, that this person deserves to be forgiven. Because there's something that allows us, this is an important part, there's something that allows us to separate the bad act from the person. And you might recall some of Strawson's considerations when you're thinking about this. So you might say, listen, this person was just having a really bad day. They got in a car crash on the way to work. And yes, they were really snappy at me and they said something really rude, but they were just, they had reasons for doing that, and then they apologized, and so I think they deserve to be forgiven, and I'm going to move on. So you kind of distance that person from the bad act somehow, or from maybe the idea that they're going to commit future bad acts. So She offers another account, and this is kind of what her paper is all about, and it's this idea of aspirational forgiveness. So, with aspirational forgiveness, we say we understand that the person acted badly. And not only did they act badly, they knowingly and willfully chose to act badly, morally. And still, with full knowledge that they are morally culpable and that maybe they are deserving of blame, they're blameworthy, we know all this and we choose to forgive them anyway. So that, she says, it's really difficult to get to that kind of forgiveness. And so that's why it's aspirational, and she's going to tell us a little bit more why. So first, how do we distinguish between these kinds of forgiveness, or rather, what might lead us to these different kinds of forgiveness? So Calhoun says that what distinguishes these types of forgiveness is the story that you tell about the wrongdoer. So in cases of minimal forgiveness, we are focusing on telling what she calls stories of desert. And these are stories that seek to separate, in some sense, the misdeed from the core of who we think this person is. It's something that, not exactly like this, but it's similar to this idea of hate the sin, not the sinner. By contrast, the aspirational story, she says, is one in which we are explicit about acknowledging the connection between the misdeed and the person. So meaning we understand them as having freely chosen to commit a wrongdoing, and still we find a way to accept this is true and forgive them anyway. So she says this aspirational story is really hard to tell, and she looks to P.F. Strawson to help explain why she thinks this is the case. So recall what you read in the Strawson paper. I'm not going to review all of that again, but essentially she says that the issue is that according to Strawson's account, which is a very popular and influential account, to accept that someone knowingly and intentionally acted wrongly towards us, that they really chose to manifest ill will towards us, is to then have strong evidence that they are not an appropriate candidate for reactive attitudes. So to put this kind of crudely is to say something like, what normal person would ever act like that? There must be something really wrong with them. To have chosen to act like that, there must be something really wrong with them. And so I should adopt the objective attitude towards them. And when I adopt the objective attitude towards them, then they aren't really even a candidate for blame or resentment in the first place, because there's something about them that's just not right. They maybe we don't even think they have the capacity to even manifest goodwill towards us and to act nicely towards us. And so we can't blame them for acting how they did. And so basically, to kind of recap the main point, the idea is that if somebody, according to a sort of Strawson-like framework, if somebody willfully chooses to act in a cruel or immoral way, in a morally blameworthy way, then there's something wrong. There's something misfiring, maybe with their faculties of reason or something. And so because of that, we aren't even going to hold them as someone who's like an appropriate object of attitudes like blame, resentment, etc. And so it's not even an issue about if we have to forgive them at all. So the question then, if this story, this aspirational story, is so hard to tell, then how do we do it? How do we make this much more difficult version of forgiveness feel like a real option for us? And she says that we do this by de-emphasizing the moral when dealing with these kinds of questions and trying to tell a biographical story about the person who has wronged us. So the crucial idea here is that instead of trying to make this person or their behavior, whatever act they committed, make moral sense to us, we sort of de-emphasize the issue of making moral sense, which is how people have traditionally kind of framed it. And we try to see if we can make this act make biographical sense to us. So we say, does this behavior make sense in the context of this person's life, even if it was a morally blameworthy choice. Even if we can't make moral sense of it, can we still kind of make biographical sense of it? So here's a really crucial distinction, or a really crucial point that I think could maybe even use some more emphasis in her paper. So she isn't saying, okay, this person had a really hard life. So now, because they had a really hard life, they are fundamentally sort of messed up, that's putting it crudely, in a way that makes them doing bad things or immoral things inevitable and thus excusable. So that is not what she's saying. To say something like that would be to adopt a sort of Strawson-like account, would be to say, look, this person can't help it. We're telling a biographical story. We're giving biographical reasons. We're saying, it's because of their childhood, or this really bad thing happened to them, or other people were very cruel to them. But the effect of that is that now they're unable, in some sense, to act morally. So we're not saying that. No. She's saying, listen, people are complicated. Life is really long. It's full of difficult circumstances. It's full of difficult choices. Let's try to understand this other person. Let's try to understand some things about their life. And then maybe we can view what we take as a wrongdoing, or what is in fact a wrongdoing, or a misdeed on their part, as expressing something biographical, expressing something that makes sense in the broader context of their life, not expressing maybe their moral beliefs all the time. So it's also really crucial to remember, and this is like sort of definitional for the aspirational forgiveness case, but it's really crucial to remember that in these cases, we aren't saying, okay, it makes biographical sense that you acted in that way, so we aren't going to hold you morally accountable. We are not saying that. What we're saying is, no, what this person did was wrong. It was morally bad. It was blameworthy. But we see a new path to forgiveness because we can understand why, given some features about your life, given some biographical features about who you are, that you made the choices you did. It makes biographical sense. And so while you're still morally blameworthy, we can find this other way to forgive you. So what distinguishes aspirational forgiveness is that we retain a full view of the other's culpability and still choose to forgive them. And Calhoun says that aspirational forgiveness, it's sort of simple, but it looks like this. It says, I'm going to give up the demand that this person be different than how they are. I'm not going to ask that this person change. And so this, this is a difficult form of forgiveness. And because of that, and for various reasons, it's a form of forgiveness that cannot be rationally required. It's not a forgiveness that can be demanded of us. It's above and beyond the demands or the requirements of rationality. So this is a bit of a longer video, and this is a fairly dense piece of philosophy. So I'm not going to get into everything that she considers. You're welcome to bring up some of her other considerations, these sort of objections that she considers in your papers or in your discussion posts. But I think that kind of gives us the overview. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out via email. Thank you.